Yeah, let's move to the next. So now we have clear that there is this massive race to the ocean. Let's look into the specifics and see who is behind this.
Yes. And so that's the second one. I'll try to keep it a bit shorter than the previous one to leave space for question 2. But this is the idea, as you said, Chantal, of who's racing. Like if you think of it as a race to the ocean, who's behind it, right? And so we published a paper that looked exactly at that in terms of transnational cooperation. So there's been a trend shown in the literature that transnational cooperation are becoming really a dominant feature of our world in terms of influence, size, and activities. And so we looked at it in the context of the ocean economy across like 8 core ocean industries, according to the OECD. And that includes the offshore oil and gas, the marine equipment and construction, the seafood, of course, the container shipping, shipbuilding and repair, cruise tourism, port activities, and offshore wind. And those 8 industries have been identified by the OECD again. What you're seeing here is that the ocean economy is highly consolidated. That means that the top 10 largest companies in each of those industries account for the vast majority of the revenues, right? Like it's striking in tourism, like 10 companies represent 93% of the whole market share. You have the same trend in port activities or container shipping, above 80%. And somehow seafood is one of the least consolidated because you have all those small scale artisanal fishing that is still so important in terms of volume. But on average, the 10 largest companies in 8 of the core ocean industry generate 45% of each industry total revenue, right? And the offshore oil and gas is the biggest today ocean-based industry with revenues close to 1 trillion. So not in terms of employers, that's seafood, but in terms of revenue, that's offshore oil and gas. If you look at who they are, this is what it looks like. Like this is just the 100 largest companies in the ocean, right? What we call the Ocean 100. And you see that it's highly dominated by offshore oil and gas, like close to half of them are offshore oil and gas companies. And for that sake, we only use the offshore revenues, right? Because those companies often operate onshore as well. But we specifically extracted the offshore revenue and they are still completely dominating. If you look where they are, this is what it looks. And it's even more striking if you look per sector, because then you really see this kind of discrepancy between, North America on one hand, Europe in some cases, and then Asia, like China. If we exclude the oil and gas, you see the pattern very clearly. USA, Europe, China, and a bit of Japan and Korea too. Because that's the oil and gas gives you a little bit of South America and Middle East too, but otherwise really consolidated here. That brings dimension of equity too, right? If you look at who they are when you don't have the oil and gas, you see that there are many more seafood companies entering the list, as well as container shipping. So the shipping, the seafood, and the shipbuilding companies are really the driving this kind of non-oil and gas Ocean 100 list. So when we published that, there was an op-ed written by Peter Thompson, the UN Special Envoy for the Ocean, entitled "What Can Cooperation Do to Help Save the Ocean?" Right? And that's the idea that given their influence and given they are there, what can they do better since they have so much impact? Another way to kind of edit that title would be to say, well, what can scientists do to help cooperation save the ocean? Because I think one could argue that maybe the corporation shouldn't decide on the agenda to save it on their own, and it should definitely be evidence-based, right? That to me links to my academic field, which is sustainability science, and where we see scientists really as change makers. So this is a quote from Robert Cates, often called the father of sustainability science, which describe it as a different kind of science that is primarily use-inspired and with significant fundamental and applied knowledge components, and committed to moving such knowledge into societal action. So it's really this idea of science that is problem-driven and solution-orientated, right? And that takes a couple of things. One of it is interdisciplinary research, where it's really the idea of bridging knowledge from multiple disciplines. Like a single discipline can't do the job on its own, right? You need this diversity of voices and perspective. And even more than that, you would need transdisciplinary research, which is not only several academic disciplines and expertise, but really engaging with stakeholders beyond academia. How to do that is challenging because scientists are traditionally not trained for that. And we really need kind of more training and more momentum from universities to break those silos to allow that. But there is a growing literature on it. This was a paper published last year about principles for co-production of knowledge, right, in sustainability research. What does it take to co-produce knowledge? Well, a couple of things to keep in mind. It needs to be context-based. So that means you situate the process in a particular context, place, or issue. That would be the Mediterranean Sea, but you could even think of like zooming even further in the Mediterranean different context and to really grasp the local specificities of it. It needs to be pluralistic, so explicitly recognizing the multiple ways of knowing and doing. It needs to be goal-orientated. So that's the objective of having, to articulate clearly defined, shared, and meaningful goals that are related to the challenge at hand. And by that, you don't need to have just one big ultimate goal, but it's good and useful to have small goals, right? Small milestones that pave the way towards your final big grand goal. And of course, it needs to be interactive. And we talked about that already in the course, like allow for ongoing learning among actors, active engagement, and frequent interaction between the different stakeholders and the scientist. One of the recommended reading that you had for the course was this paper about science-industry collaboration. Is it sideways or highways to ocean sustainability, right? Like, meaning, is it basically a distraction and a waste of time, or could it accelerate transformation towards sustainability? And of course, you can find arguments either way. Some of the why collaboration is an obvious opportunity is what I just presented to you now until then, which is this increasing complexity of the ocean space, right? And as individuals or as scientists or as experts in one field, it's really hard to have all the answers and to have all the solution to it. So that collaborating with industries and across disciplines really help making sense of this ocean space. Then another aspect that's often overlooked is that some scientists already speak the language of business, right? There are like entire academic disciplines like accounting and accountability and financing and corporate social responsibility experts who knows that, who knows companies, who knows industry. And that speaks to the value of interdisciplinary science, the same way as it's often ecologists like bringing the solution, and we forget about social scientists which know how to collaborate, which know people, which study people, who really know that. And so there's a real strength in building an interdisciplinary team with different expertise from different disciplines, because you will be surprised how many of those people already know about like cooperation or human behavior or human interactions. Then, of course, there's a lot to be aware of in terms of why it's not necessarily an obvious opportunity. And that speaks to the disciplinary boundaries. I talked about it, like too much of university is in silos still. The cultural differences, of course, like geographically or in terms of worldviews. And then, of course, the risk of failure, because at the end of the day, industry is profit driven, right? So what the industry will go for is profit. And there is a lot of greenwashing out there where industry collaborate because it's good public relationship and good communication for them, but it doesn't really translate into concrete changes. So in the paper, and I encourage you to read it because it's really just a summary of personal experiences from people that have engaged with industry over the years in different contexts. We kind of use the analogy of a roadmap and an actual road trip to give a few key recommendations for engaging with science industry collaboration, right? The first stage would be to load up the car. Before you go on a road trip, you need to put your luggages in it. And that means establishing relationship founded on trust and mutual respect. That means building interdisciplinary team, as I just mentioned, which includes expertise in engagement specifically with different actors in navigating those processes. And of course, early on, it's important to develop shared goals that represent the value of all partners. Once you have established that foundation, you pull out of the driveway, and that's the beginning of it. That means you need to clarify and formalize the responsibilities and roles of all the partners involved. You need to ensure transparency and communication throughout the whole engagement. It's very important to communicate on a regular basis and to be transparent about your expectation, each other expectation. And of course, I mean, it's almost taken for granted, but it's important not to trade the scientific integrity for industry dollars, right? Those are two very different worlds. And there is a lot of money in one world, there is less so in the other one. And I think like the credibility of science and the credibility of evidence-based knowledge really relies on somehow and to the extent possible on financial independence from the stakeholders that you're engaging with. Otherwise, you will always have some kind of suspicion, even though it might not be the case. But it's always good to favor having this financial independence one way or another. Then you enjoy the ride. That's when things gets going, and that's it. You have trust, you have clarified the responsibility and roles, and that's a time where you can be reflexive and seek to really learn and adapt from the experience, right? You also, at that point, open to emergent opportunities like the inclusion of new project partners. And another important aspect there is to accept that, you know, things are not going to go smoothly. It never does. So there are going to be bumps on the roads, and you need to accept those setbacks because they happen to everyone in every project. It never goes as planned, and you always have to somehow adapt. And that takes a lot of resilience, personal resilience and team resilience, but also to remain optimistic that eventually you will succeed in something. And that's where having small goals rather than just one single goal is really helpful, because you can tick those more doable milestones that are on the way to the ultimate goal of your project. And the final one is the kids in the back of the car saying, are we there yet? And that's the recognition that a lot of those projects takes time, right? And so you need to stay committed to it in order to achieve the desired outcomes. It's not going to happen over time. In the next session, I'll report on one of our engagement with the industry, and we're in year 5 now, and we barely got them to commit to some time-bound goals. So it takes a lot of time, right? And so you need to continue to engage. You need to be mindful of not letting the relationship diminish over time. So even though you've built that initial trust, sometimes people change in the project. You have a turnover, like the CEO is replaced and it's a new one that comes in. And so at that stage, it's very useful to formalize some of those changes through written agreements to kind of maintain a more institutionalized collaboration that builds on what you've done previously, but set the direction for what's to come. I'll stop here before moving to the next one.
Oops, sorry, I was silent. Thanks a lot, Jean-Baptiste, for this second part. Really, really interesting. And actually the road is long, and very often when we work in sustainability and we talk to the business, they're more interested by when is it going to be being profitable. So that's also a very important thing to take into account. Do we have questions? Do we have people in the room willing to raise their hands and ask for precisions or raise a point? I mean, it's not only necessarily question and answers, it can be a discussion too.
I think that's a good point, Chantal. I mean, we would really welcome your own experience, I think, in the context maybe of what has been presented there. Yeah, so don't hesitate to share it.
So first of all, thank you for your brilliant presentation. I really enjoyed it. Just personal experience, I'm a researcher, and sometimes we have people or companies asking us for helping, and so it's always very difficult, what you say, not to see the difference between brainwashing and really the will to do something, and as well us as a public research institution not to be committed in in values which are not in our side. Like, for example, if if you're designing something to drink which is from the deep water, so the deep water is supposed to be very beneficial, but we don't believe in it. So we do accept some money and some exchange and some thought from us on their webpage, because it's not in, well, it's not what we think. In fact, we don't think that this is benefit. So it's always very difficult for me to understand where to go and where not to go. I don't know if I've been clear.
No, you have, Karin, absolutely, and I think I would expect this feeling to be shared by many of the trainees and the participant here. It is a really difficult landscape and kind of a gray area, right? And I think that's why there is thankfully a kind of an emerging literature that gives principles or advice or report on expertise that you can learn from in terms of what has worked or what hasn't. So I think that's one way to start. At the end of the day, no one will know better than you whether you can engage, right? So a few things I could say in response to you is that there is always a risk. I think this is taken for granted, that it is a risky endeavor to engage with industry like that, because as much as we talked about uncertainty earlier in day one and day two, right? So uncertainty is everywhere, and it's there too. It's also in your relationship with industry. But on top of that, you have kind of an opinion of worldview clash too, where often it's even seen, from a scientific perspective, often the industry is seen as kind of the bad guys out there doing bad, and the scientists are seen as those naive utopists that don't really know how the real world works. And so you will have those kind of stereotypes beforehand, which are shortcuts somehow to make sense of the complex reality. And it is difficult to navigate them. At the end of the day, it will always be an ongoing experiment, right? One way to look at it, though, is what if you don't engage? What if you're not engaging? Where do you have the most influence and power? Is it in really engaging with the industry and trying to steer them in the right direction, even at the risk that it might fail, and that's something you can learn from? Or are you just sitting back and looking at them operating? So I think it is a difficult line to walk, and that's where some kind of principles and safeguards too. It's important that you don't commit your time just for the sake of the industry, right? Often your enthusiasm and you're so keen in changing the situation, if not the world, that you pour all your energy into that, and you kind of forget about the science behind it even, right? Like you really commit, and you become almost like a kind of a pro bono consulting for the industry, and you don't know the outcome. So I think it's always important to keep clear eyes on your science and on your deliverables, what you want to get out of this collaboration. And that's somehow what was communicated when saying, expressing like expectation and clear goals. So it's not just about what the industry wants out of it, but you also really, from the onset, clarify what you will get out of it as a scientist. And the ideal world is when those things overlap, of course. But a difficult one, and I share your feeling here.
Thank you.
Sorry, Jean-Baptiste, a follow-up on this precise point. What is your ideal outcome? What do you want to get out of this engagement? I understand you are now engaged in a certain, I don't know the details, but it sounded like you have an ongoing activity with business. What is your deliverable? What's your output? What's your goal? To just be a little bit more tangible with what we're discussing.
Is it okay if you wait for a few minutes? Because that will be the topic of the next. No, it's a really legitimate question. But I think like the next presentation, which will also be the final one before the break, we kind of answer or some of those questions. And if not, for sure, we'll get back to it in the next Q&A, if that's okay. It's not to dodge the question. It's because it's coming up.
Okay, we have Marta Pascual raising hand. So please, Marta, turn on your camera.
Yes. Okay, so thank you, Jean-Baptiste, for this interesting presentation. I actually found the first map that you show very, very engaging. Actually, it made me think a lot and how to really make it clear, that everything is connected. And I think that is something that we need to show to the businesses somehow. So I would just like to briefly show my experience, because I do have both hands. I mean, I am a scientist, but I am also an insider between different businesses and different policy making. So my experience, and it can be summarized into when I was invited as a scientist to a table of the World Ocean Council, which is one of the councils that brings most of the maritime sectors. I was feeling like an insider there, and I really didn't fit between all these business and CEOs and etc. of the big businesses. But someone told me, if you are not in this table, then you are at the plate, you're the food. So it really made me think how much we need to tell them and how much we need to learn on how to express what we need to show even in an ocean literacy way, because when you hear them, what they really understand about sustainability, some of them think that recycling and even recycling the paper in their businesses is what really makes the difference when they are dealing with seafood and aquaculture. And they say, oh, look, I do save a lot of water through recycling my paper. And then you go back to the actual activity and say, how much of that water are you saving in the actual aquaculture businesses or in the actual business that you are doing in the maritime sector? Say, I haven't really calculated that. That's real sustainability. So bringing this kind of food for thought in a nice way. I mean, not in an opposition. As you say, there are stereotypes, and we should not be advocates of one side or the other side, but we need to play with the knowledge that we have about these connections on the maritime sectors to try to bring them into the business. Which also brings me to, you were showing to the big businesses of the maritime sectors, which is good, but I would say that also it's a bit biased, because I understand they are the ones that pollute more or could pollute more and impact more. And that's affecting sustainability. But I mean, the maritime sector has many small and many smaller businesses. So they are actually doing things much better, or trying to do things much better, because they are in closer collaboration with the society, and they need to really show to the society that they are doing things better. So maybe a peer pressure of those ones to the big ones, even though they cannot compete into their businesses and the budgets. I think maybe that's also the way to have this conversation going. But thank you very much for your insightful talk. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Marta, because I think a lot of you raised a lot of good points there, and again, I'm looking forward the session we'll have after the break, which will be very much more open, and I'm already impatient to have this kind of interaction with you and to have the time to go more in depth. Like, two things you mentioned though that are very relevant. The first one is what kind of is on the agenda of the companies, and I like the way you described about the recycling, because this is absolutely the case. Like, you know, and I will talk about it in a few moments. When we engage with those large seafood companies, one thing that they really wanted to tackle was plastic pollution, and we felt like, well, sure enough, plastic pollution is important, but you really have, you know, other issues at hand, from illegal fishing, forced labor, like emissions of the fuel emissions, and so on, and lack of traceability. So there is a clear role of scientists in kind of shaping the sustainability agenda and not letting the industry define what the problems are and how they're going to solve it. And to me, that's maybe the biggest motivation I have in engaging with industry, is that maybe it wasn't the case 30 years ago, but now sustainability is definitely on their radar, right? It's on everyone's boardroom, every annual report, more or less every company has a sustainability report. So that battle is won somehow. But the question is, who defines what sustainability is in that context? Is it the industry itself, or is it evidence-based? And in a sense that the scientists have a role there to really define the problems and then co-design the solution. But we can't just let the industry define the problem somehow. And that maybe links a bit to Yanea's question about the what I'm hoping out there. I'm hoping to shape the agenda somehow. And I forgot your second point, but it was also very relevant, I think, what you mentioned after the agenda.
Yes, the link with the smaller businesses.
Yes, yeah, that's very interesting. That's really interesting that you bring that up in terms of how those smaller could influence the big ones, because what I'm going to present now is the other way around in terms of theory of change. It's to take the other approach, not the bottom up, but the top down, and say, look, if we identify those big corporations, they're so big and they have so many companies under them that maybe if they change, it could cascade through the whole industry. And I think there is no right or wrong there, but we will talk about it again after. Let's move maybe to the presentation.
Okay, so you did the transition yourself, which is perfect. So we'll go through your third presentation and then again give the floor to participants, and then we will have a 10 minutes break.
Good. How are we doing on time, Chantal?
No, we're good. We're good.
We're good. All right. So let's get going. So this is different. This is more like real world kind of situation where I will just present to you an initiative that we've been working on for many years now, and that consisted in engaging with the world's 10th largest seafood companies to change their practices, or at least engage in dialogue. So this is a timeline of it. I mean, it goes up to 2017, 2018, but I will update you from what happened afterwards. And you see it split into two processes, somehow the scientific process and then what I would call the co-design process, like the engagement with the actual stakeholders. But let's start with the scientific process. Back already in 2012, kind of the initial idea, but then long period of data collection and until the first publication. And at that stage, we hadn't engaged with any of the company yet, right? So what we went on to do was to think of companies and large corporations in marine ecosystem a bit in the same way as in ecology. I come from ecology originally. You think of keystone species. So those species that are in the ecosystem and have really a disproportionate influence on their ecosystem, right? And so the idea and the research question was that, well, could we find some similarities with keystone species, but in the world of the industry? Like, could there be keystone actors that really shape the ecosystem from an industry perspective? When you look at the seafood industry, this is what it looks like when you consider the largest 160 seafood companies in the world, right? You have what's called the keystone pattern, which is an asymmetrical distribution, which you see in many sectors, to be fair, but very striking in the seafood, where you just have a handful of companies that have a disproportionate influence and then a very long tail of companies. This is ranked by revenues. So we identified that and we decided to look more in details into those kind of potential key actors and who they were and where they were coming from, right? So you see their name here and their headquarters. So the two largest seafood companies in the world are Japanese. You have a lot of Norwegian ones due to salmon farming and feed producing, like aqua feeds. Then some Thai companies as well, South Korea one, and then there was a Chinese, which since then has had a lot of issues, so it's not really any longer on the picture, and then an American one, Trident Seafood, engaged in Pollock in Alaska. So we identified them and we went on for a lengthy and tedious process of understanding how much they produce and where, right, and of which species. We came to the conclusion, and it's very conservative estimates because if anything, the seafood world is known not to be transparent, that together this cohort of company, they add up to 40% of several of the world's largest and most valuable stocks. So we're really talking about a handful of companies or two handfuls of companies that together account for a really big percentage of production of key commercial species across the world. We also looked at where they operated, and they operate everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And keep in mind that we're talking about a dozen of companies only, and together they handle, more than 200 species. At least that's what we thought back then. Now we know that it's way higher than that. It's actually 500 plus species. And together they have close to 1,000 subsidiaries. So subsidiaries are companies under their authority, right, in their supply chain. And they operate in more than 100 countries altogether. So, and you see the map here. And that led us to define those companies and to propose the idea of Keystone Actors as companies that dominate global production revenues and volumes, control globally relevant segment of the seafood production. So it's not only salmon, it's not only shrimp, it's all of those different segments together. They connect ecosystems globally through a worldwide network of subsidiaries. And of course, what we found too is that they do influence global governance processes and institutions. And that's something important to keep in mind when it comes to a power relationship. And one of the conclusions of the paper at the time was that, well, given this influence, given this status of Keystone Actors, if they were to do things better, it could really result in cascading effect throughout the entire seafood industry and potentially enable the critical transition towards improved management. And that speculative conclusion, if you may, became kind of a hypothesis, being like, okay, can we try that? Can we actually test that? Can we try to engage with those companies and see whether, because they are so big, which intuitively would be like, this is not good, could we flip it over and use that influence for the best? And so we went on, and that's the second phase of it. So we published that paper. And that paper, to try to get to the data, already like familiarized us with a lot of those companies, right? And so we use those relationships somehow to engage on a number of bilateral meetings with the different companies. So going to Bergen, for Norway, Seoul, Tokyo, many times, and having one-on-one conversation at the executive level of those companies, trying to check the temperature of whether they would be interested in meeting, basically. And one thing we were aiming at was some kind of executive level. We were really hoping to bring in the CEO of those companies. So not the head of the corporate social responsibility department, but really taking the top of the companies, the person who would be able to have an authority and move it. So as you see, it took several months, if not years, but it eventually resulted into what we call the first Keystone Dialogue, which happened in November 2016, took place in the Maldives. And we entitled that Transformative Risks and Opportunities for the Global Seafood Industry. And there we had around the table, the person you see there is Her Royal Highness, the Crown Princess Victoria of Sweden, that we had as a patron of the meeting in her quality of ambassador for the SDG 14 in the United Nations. So it really brought up some kind of high-level profile that maybe has contributed in getting those people around the table. You never know. But who we had around the table was the two largest seafood companies in the world by revenue, Maruha and Nisri. We had the two biggest in tuna specialists, so Thai Union and Dongwon, Thai and Korean respectively. We had the two largest farmed salmon producers in the world at the time. So Marine Harvest changed its name now to Maui, and Cermaq has been bought by Mitsubishi Corporation, but they are still really big. And we also had the two largest aqua feed manufacturers, so really important feed producers in the seafood supply chain. And this meeting resulted in a joint statement by the CEOs of those 8 companies, committing their companies to act on 10 different points that addressed really like pressing issues in the seafood industry. And that goes from the engaging in concerted effort to eliminate any form of modern slavery and forced labor, to improving transparency and traceability, reducing and fighting, eliminating IUU fishing, so illegal and unreported and unregulated fishing, to more like specific commitment, for instance, to the aquaculture sector, but the use of antibiotics, the use of plastic, the use of greenhouse gas emission, and engagement for innovation, and so on. And not only did they commit to that, but they also established a new initiative called the Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship, SeaBOS, that was perceived as unique because it was connecting science and business. It was connecting fisheries and aquaculture, and it was also connecting seafood companies all over the world. So we had the 3 big markets, right? Like North America, Europe, and Asia. And those 3 dimensions together were unique. Like you had initiatives, industry initiative within the salmon industry, for instance. A famous one is the Global Salmon Initiative, where it's a bunch of big salmon producers that came together and tried to do things better. But those 3 dimensions together, the science business, the fisheries and aquaculture, and the geographical span of it, was perceived as unique. And that was 2016. And what happened next? Well, we kept talking with them. When we went in for the first dialogue, talking about small goals, our goal was, okay, it will be a success if they agree to talk again. So far it had really it had gone beyond our expectation. And we went on for a second dialogue. So we engaged again, we traveled back to the different companies, see what they were expecting from this initiative, building relationship and clarifying goals and expectation. That led to a second dialogue, this time in Stockholm, 6 months later, about advancing the seafood business for ocean stewardship initiative, right? It was not enough just to have created that initiative. Now, what do we do with it? The novelty there was that 2 more companies joined, like CPF, which is Charen Pokphand Food, like a really big conglomerate in Thailand, and Kyokuyo, who is like the 3rd largest Japanese seafood companies, and basically realized that if both Maruha and Nishiri were on board, they better be on the train as well, because that together they are the big ones in Japan. And there was a new statement that really kind of enshrined the objective and the ambition of CBOS, and also was calling for, like, a pledge from their perspective to ocean stewardship, but also a plea to governments to engage the dialogue to governments for like a leveling playing field, and so on. And so this was back 2016, 2017, and since then there's been an annual Keystone Dialogue, and we realized that was not enough, because the Keystone Dialogues are at the CEO level, and we needed much more work to be done before we could get to the CEO. So the 2 first dialogues were at the CEO level. After that, like what you see here, the 3rd one, the Amersfoort Dialogue, was what we call the working meeting, where we're not meeting necessarily with the CEO, but we're meeting with the operational staff within the companies to kind of do the homework, prepare and pave the way like month ahead of the next Keystone Dialogues. And we do that, and we have repeated that since then over the years. So every time a working meeting in the spring, and usually a CEO meeting in the fall. And so somehow CBOS has become institutionalized officially. It now includes the 10 of the world's largest seafood companies, which together work towards leadership in ocean sustainability. Those are the companies here. And the vision is plainly to stimulate transformative change towards ocean stewardship, right? How can we change the industry? And how to do that is by the industry taking on the global responsibility for the ocean and actively engaging in stewardship, including working with governments and other sustainability initiatives. So CBOS has become some kind of a platform to basically promote sustainability in the seafood industry. It has also structured itself into 6 different task forces. And those task forces are led by companies and supported by scientists, right? So it's the companies are leading it, but the science is provided, of course, by us in different topics. So as far as like addressing IUU and forced labor, the traceability, engaging with governments, reducing ocean plastic, I mentioned it, that was definitely not on our priority, but it was on the company's priority. So you have to do compromise sometimes, make compromise. And of course, the notion of climate resilience. This is my final slide. It's to say that it's still ongoing. In September 2020, we had the 5th official Keystone Dialogue with the CEO. It had to be online, which is something we can talk again, maybe in the discussion as the challenges of moving such initiative or such relationships online compared to being in person. But that one resulted in so far the biggest breakthrough of it, which was a commitment to time-bound goals. So really companies signing on to time-bound goals of, by 2021, we will have eliminated IUU in our supply chain. By 2025, we'll have eliminated in our tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, which are like subsidiaries of subsidiaries, and so on. So really concrete commitments. Now, from a scientific perspective, and from our perspective, it still is an experiment. And we don't know whether it will fail or it will succeed. It is ongoing, and we keep monitoring it. We keep like fueling it, but we don't know, and we're monitoring it as such. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jean-Baptiste. Really, really interesting case study. We are running 10 minutes late, but I would take a few questions. And then in any case, we have, as you said, we've got this nice session where we will have more time to address a number of questions and discussions. Is there, I see someone is raising their hand. Martina?
Yes, Barbara, please. You
Yes.
can unmute yourself and turn on the camera. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jean-Baptiste. This was a very interesting and amazing example for co-creation and for actually bringing about change and bringing these, well, let's say, difficult parties together to the table. And I would love to learn really in detail how you did that, but to make it easier, I have two questions. What would you say were really the key enablers to bring these parties to the table and to get their commitment to the process? Also relating to, I think I saw that the CBOS initiative was pledged at the UN Ocean Conference as one of the voluntary commitments. If I'm not mistaken, that would also be a question whether such things are also sort of important drivers, because then there is a very open political or not process, but it's very high maybe then on the agenda. So how important are these things? And the other thing is, where did you get the funding for such a process? Because that's quite different from the usual, I guess, from the usual funding streams and funding opportunities. What you need for such an exercise. Really great example. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Barbara. I mean, lots of really good question there, and one that overlaps with Andrea's question as well in the case of funding. So I might start with this one. So the funding, it's from Philanthropist Foundation. So all the funding basically of the CBOS initiative as such has been for like the three North American foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore, the Walton family, and the Packard Foundation, to which we applied basically a grant proposing it. And that in itself wasn't easy. The first answer we got was like, we do not give money for dialogues. And that's exactly what we wanted to get. So we had to go around and discuss and clarify what were our hopes and expectations, but they were really the enabler. That came though for the first dialogue itself, right? All the work before was just us doing work, and like this mapping exercise was not funded as such. It was part of everyone's kind of research agenda at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. Once we realized we needed more resources to actually materialize that series of dialogue, this is where the funding came from, and it's still the case. So the science is funded by those philanthropists. So they've committed on 3 years. First, it was just a pilot thing, and then given the success of the first meeting, they committed to 3 years and then 3 years again. So this is the source of funding that we have. And now for the companies, now that CBOS has become institutionalized, the companies themselves have a membership fees for them to be part of the CBOS, which has allowed in the last year, in 2019, to hire like an executive director, because the scientists, we kind of took over for many years the secretariat of it somehow. And that's something that we always thought we would do temporary. And so eventually we were able to hire an executive director, not with the funding of the foundation, but with the companies themselves paying for an executive director, which is Martin Excel, who's not a scientist per se, but who's at the interface between us and the company somehow. And that's as CBOS evolves. So, sorry, a bit of a long answer on funding. For the key enablers, maybe we can take it more in depth in the next session, because I think that speaks about opportunities and barriers. But very quickly, shocks would be one. And really, if you go back in 2015, the Thai shrimp industry, if anything, had been completely flipped over with the issue of modern slavery and forced labor, which was on every possible media and headlines across the world. And that really creating a feeling for the seafood industry that, well, they needed to do things better, right? They can't really keep going. So this is like serendipity. You never know what happens, but I think the timing was right because the sustainability agenda was on their mind somehow. National connectors, very important. Like all those meetings, you see those bilateral meetings where, through ambassadors, through like people working in the companies, but not at all at the executive levels, through journalists who had connections. So trying to build those connections with people who could enable you to reach another level. And for the UN, absolutely, you're right. So in 2017, we had a side event. So CBOS was part of a side event to the UN Ocean Conference. And we really saw that as the companies sticking their neck out. You don't come back from those events. So that's the point too. It's like the more they go public, the more they will be held accountable, hopefully. And so that's the value of such high profile event, is that they get a profile, they get a name and they need to deliver, because like NGOs are waiting. And that's good. That's the role of NGOs, to wait and to make them accountable. But we can talk more about that maybe in the next session. I see a question from Yanea, but very quickly, the answer is quick about the GDST, the Global Dialogue of Seafood Traceability. For CBOS is a member of GDST. So as the coalition, CBOS signed on to the GDST really early on, seeing it as a very promising initiative. And so joining force there and supporting the GDST. So as its own entity, CBOS, so the 10 companies have signed on to that and work very closely with it.
Okay, we might want to give the floor to Cynthia, as Marta already had a chance to speak, just to be a bit fair between all the participants. So Cynthia.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I really enjoying watching your presentation, Jean-Baptiste. Very interesting about the CBOS and all the effort. And I mean, it was a really huge thing. You managed all this movement to reach. I was wondering if there is any thought on when you are continuing with the activities and meetings, and is it in the agenda to consider also the marine protected areas, the rebuilding the ocean movement by Carlos Duarte, because it will be a great opportunity to explore that. I don't know if you have seen last week as well, there was a paper about the effects of trawling in the oceans and the release of CO2 that is actually compared to the aviation. So it's in the same scale, so it's really huge. So is there any thought about on bringing that into the table?
Yes, again, lots of good points, Cynthia, there, and I agree. Yes, so for those, I think first of all, I really welcome that study, because something you hear a lot in the seafood industry, that is one of the most climate-friendly food production system, right? And it's a narrative that they are very comfortable pushing, because it has some truth to it. But I think it was very nice to show indeed the impact of bottom trawling, if anything, and to kind of flip that narrative over and say, well, there is definitely a margin of improvement there. Whether we're tackling those in CBOS, the answer is yes, absolutely. So the thing is that it's a stepwise process, right? And when we first met those companies, I mean, it's easy to pitch to them that, in 2020, you shouldn't have any forced labor on board of your vessels. That's something everyone can agree around the table, right? None of the CEO is going to stand up and say, no, I want slaves on my boats, basically. So that doesn't happen. I think Jim Leap at a conference a few years back said, it doesn't really matter if your fish is sustainable if it's caught by slaves. And I think that summarizes it. So one of the biggest issue we tackled was this kind of like forced labor, how to eliminate modern slavery, not just in their own operation, but in their entire supply chain. And that links to the issue of traceability and transparency, and by extension to the issue of illegal fishing, because the same way no one can stand up and say, well, I'm proud of illegal practices, right? So those were the two forefront that we moved. And in parallel to that, we moved the antibiotic agenda in the aquaculture, which is one of the biggest challenges that the industry faces. So those have been our priorities since then. But it's interesting that you mention it, because the next working meeting, which is taking place in May this year, we're bringing in the MPAs, and we're bringing in the endangered species, among other. The endangered species has been a very, very hot topic to discuss, right? We have Japanese companies, the perception there of what is an endangered species or not is very different. So I think this is a much more political discussion too, but we're bringing them, and we're using the recent science and the paper you mentioned, among other, and the 30 by 30 agenda to really bring in and hopefully get some traction there with CBOS that could, commit to voluntary closure, if anything, or support or voice some kind of support for some initiative. But it's harder. it's harder. So we needed to deal with the kind of the elephant in the room, and then start having the other problems.
Okay, thanks a lot. I see there are more questions, but as we said, now we're going to have, after the break, more space for discussion and more questions. So I suggest that we break now for 10 minutes, and then we will continue this this very exciting discussion around how the business is doing in the ocean.
Yeah, thanks, Chantal. And I see a lot of the questions are really spot on for what we were hoping to discuss after.
Absolutely.
So I think that's really just will be the continuity, but after a break. Thanks.
Okay, so get some fresh air and energy, everybody. See you in 10 minutes. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.